I learned that my wife was cheating on me. Exactly as she once learned about me, I saw it by accident, and at that moment my brain simply refused to function normally because it was too straightforward, too obvious, and too painful to be some mistake or misunderstanding. And that's what killed me the most. There was no room for doubt, no hope that I had misunderstood something, because the photo on her laptop was open full screen, as if deliberately left there for me to see. And in it, she stood next to him. Too close. With that expression I knew better than anyone, with that smile that was never accidental. And in that moment I felt something inside me snap sharply, as if someone had simply pulled the foundation out from under my life, and everything I had built over the years ceased to matter in 1 second. I didn't close the laptop right away. I stood and stared at that screen longer than I should have, trying to find anything that could be explained differently, trying to convince myself that it was just a good angle, that it was some friends meeting, that I was exaggerating, that I had become paranoid. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became that this was no accident, that this was no mistake, that this wasn't just a photograph, but confirmation of something that had already happened or was happening right now. And it was at this moment that a thought arose in my head that made me physically ill, because I realized not only that she was cheating on me, but that she knew I would see it. I stepped back from the desk as if the laptop could burn me, and tried to breathe evenly, but I couldn't because everything inside began to contract. And simultaneously there appeared a strange sensation that I couldn't immediately recognize because it wasn't just shock, not just anger, and not just fear. It was something else, something familiar, something from the past, and when that feeling finally formed into a thought, I felt even worse, because I realized that I had already experienced this, but from the other side, 5 years ago. I didn't want to think about it at that moment because it seemed unrelated, because I was trying to focus on what was happening now, on the fact that my wife, with whom I had lived so many years, stood in a photograph with another man the way she should only stand with me. But memory doesn't ask permission. It simply returns when it needs to. And I suddenly saw before me not only this screen, but also the old photo album that I had left on the table back then because I decided to reminisce about the past, because I thought it was safe, because I believed it was a closed chapter long ago. It wasn't just an album. It was my mistake. I remembered that evening too clearly. Remembered sitting alone, flipping through pages, looking at photographs I shouldn't have kept because they were of her, not my wife, but another, the one with whom everything started wrong and ended even worse, because she was no longer alive, because she had died. And it was this that gave me the illusion that all of it remained in the past, that it didn't matter, that it didn't threaten my present, that I could simply live on because no one else would ever know. But she found out. I still remember her face at that moment when she held that album in her hands. Remember how she said nothing immediately, how she simply looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. And it was worse than any scandal, worse than shouting, worse than accusations, because there was no hysteria in her gaze. There was something else in it, something cold, something final. And then I tried to explain, tried to say that it was long ago, that it didn't matter, that it was a mistake that couldn't be fixed but had already happened, and I lived with it. And it was true because I had indeed lived with it all these years, simply pretending it didn't affect my life. I didn't leave then. I stayed with her. And to be completely honest, I stayed not because I made the right choice, but because it was convenient for me. Because my wife was there, because she was stability, because it was easier with her, because with her was a life that could be controlled, unlike what I had with that other one, with the one I couldn't completely forget even after her death. And this was a truth I never spoke aloud, but always knew. And now, standing before this laptop, I suddenly understood that perhaps she too had known more all this time than she showed. I approached the table again and looked at the photograph, already without trying to deceive myself, because something new began forming inside. Something scarier than the infidelity itself. And it was the feeling that none of this was accidental, that this wasn't simply her mistake, not simply weakness, not simply a moment, but that this could be something deliberate, something that had a cause that I myself had created. I began scrolling through the last months in my head, trying to find moments I had missed, words I hadn't paid attention to, changes that had seemed insignificant, and suddenly there were too many of them. Too many to be coincidence, too many to ignore. And at that moment, I understood that I hadn't simply failed to notice. I hadn't wanted to notice. I heard the door open, and it was like a blow to the head because I wasn't ready, because I had no plan, no words, nothing except this heavy, crushing understanding that everything had changed and that there would be no going back. I closed the laptop, but it was already too late. Everything had already happened. And in that moment, I understood that my life had just split in two, and neither would ever be the same again. I tried to behave as if I could control everything, as if this was just an unpleasant episode that could be taken apart, explained, organized on shelves, and somehow survived. But the more I thought, the more I understood that I had no right to look at this only from the position of the victim, because this whole situation began forming into one continuous chain, and at the center of this chain was I myself. And this was the heaviest realization of all possible. I didn't immediately begin remembering her, but it was inevitable, because without her none of this made sense. And to be honest, everything began with her. Long before I saw that photograph on my wife's laptop. Long before this person with whom she has now appeared in my life. Long before my wife even became someone important to me. I was already married when I met Elisha, and this is a fact from which there is no escape, however inconvenient it may be. Because this wasn't a story about how someone single-handedly destroyed a perfect marriage. It was something much more complicated and much messier. Because at the moment when everything began, my marriage already existed. I just didn't fully understand what it meant to me. I wasn't looking for this, and it sounds like an excuse. But it's true, because I didn't wake up in the morning with the thought that today I would start something that would destroy everything. I simply lived my ordinary life. Worked, came home, built something stable, understandable, safe. And that was the problem because everything was too smooth, too predictable, too lifeless. And I didn't realize this until I met her. With Elisha, everything was different from the very beginning, and I still can't properly explain how it happened, because it wasn't a gradual rapprochement, wasn't a long journey from acquaintance to something more. It was like a blow. Like a sharp change of state when you suddenly understand that you feel something you shouldn't feel but can no longer stop. And it was frightening because I had never before experienced anything so strong. I remember this feeling too well. Remember catching myself thinking about her constantly. Remember how I began looking for reasons to meet. How I started telling myself that this was just friendship, just interest, just a temporary state that would pass. But it didn't pass. It only intensified. And at some point I stopped deceiving myself because it became obvious that this wasn't just something random, but something that had already become part of me. And here everything became truly complicated, because simultaneously with this I returned home to my wife, who knew nothing, who lived in a reality where she had a husband who was there, who was reliable, who wouldn't betray. And it was this that made everything even worse, because I understood that I was living a double life, and each of them seemed real in its own way, but together they couldn't exist. With Elisha, I felt what I had never felt before, and this wasn't something light or romantic. It was a heavy, painful, almost destructive feeling that gave no peace, that made me doubt everything I had, that made any stability meaningless, because next to her everything seemed real, and everything else was just background. I'm not proud of this, but I can't deny it, because this was the truth of my life at that moment, and when it all ended, it wasn't a relief. It was a catastrophe, because she was gone suddenly, without the possibility to fix anything, without the possibility to end it properly, without even the possibility to simply talk one last time, and this left an emptiness inside me that I couldn't fill with anything. And then my wife brought me back to life, though she didn't even know from where she needed to bring me back. She didn't know the whole truth. She didn't know how deep I was in this, how much it broke me. She simply was there, did what a person who loves does, supported, endured, didn't ask unnecessary questions, and gradually I began returning to reality, began living again, began functioning again, and it was then that I decided to stay with her, to choose this life, because it was the only one I had left. But this didn't mean that everything disappeared. It simply meant that I learned to live with it. And now, years later, standing before the fact of her infidelity, I suddenly understood that perhaps for her all this looked different, that perhaps all this time she felt something I didn't even try to understand, that perhaps that moment with the album wasn't just an unpleasant truth for her, but something that destroyed her from within, just as something is now being destroyed within me. When I finally spoke to her after seeing that photograph, I expected denial, excuses, perhaps even aggression, but not what I received, because she was calm, too calm. And this calmness was scarier than any hysteria because there was no doubt in it, no fear, no attempt to preserve something. She said it wasn't serious. She said it was simple. She said it was revenge. And when she said it had been going on for 4 years, I literally lost my sense of time, because 4 years isn't a mistake. It isn't an accident. It isn't a moment of weakness. It's a whole parallel life about which I knew nothing. And it was so absurd that at first I couldn't even accept it. I began asking myself questions that had no answers, began remembering where I had been all these years, how I could not have noticed, how I could have been so blind. And the scariest thing was that the more I thought, the more I understood that perhaps I simply hadn't wanted to see. She said that everything was easy with him, that there were no obligations, that it wasn't love, that it wasn't a replacement, that it was simply a way of coping with what she had learned then. And at some point I understood that I didn't know what was worse, if it had been serious or if it really was just revenge, stretched over 4 years. Because if it was revenge, it meant she had lived with it all this time. It meant she made a choice every day. It meant she looked at me and knew. And at that moment something finally broke inside me, because I understood that there was no more trust, that no explanations would return me to that point where everything was clear. And the scariest thing was that I no longer understood which of us began destroying this life first, and whether there was even a right answer to this question. I continued clinging to the idea that this could still be stopped, that even after everything said, after these 4 years, after this photograph, after her calmness in which there wasn't a drop of regret, there remained a chance to somehow turn everything back. And this wasn't so much a rational decision as a desperate attempt not to finally acknowledge that I had already lost everything. Because if I acknowledged this, I would have to acknowledge everything else, including what began long before this moment and to which I myself had contributed. I began talking about how we could try to figure it out, that we could see a specialist, that we could honestly discuss everything that had happened, without trying to defend ourselves or accuse. And at that moment it seemed to me that I was doing the right things, that I was behaving like an adult ready to take responsibility and fight for his life. But inside it all looked different, because this was panic disguised as common sense, fear of being alone disguised as a desire to save the marriage. And the more I tried to appear rational, the more I felt I was losing control. She listened to me, not interrupting, not arguing, and this was again that same cold calmness I had seen before, which meant that the decision had already been made. I just hadn't fully caught up with this thought yet. And when I finished, when I laid out everything I could, she didn't destroy anything with words, didn't shout, didn't remind me of the past. She simply said that it no longer made sense. And at that moment I felt for the first time, not anger, not jealousy, but emptiness. Because this was final. I didn't believe it immediately, because the brain refuses to accept such things quickly. It looks for loopholes, looks for inconsistencies, tries to cling to any detail that would allow saying that this isn't the end, that this is just a crisis that can be survived. And I began asking questions that sounded stupid even to myself, because the answers to them were already obvious. But I needed to hear something that would give the illusion of control. And it was then that she spoke about the documents. It sounded as calmly as everything else, without pressure, without trying to hurt, simply as a fact that had long existed independently of me, And at that moment, time seemed to compress into one point again, because I understood that I was late, that all this time while I was trying to understand what was happening, while I was scrolling through the last months in my head, she had already walked this path, already made the decision, already taken steps I didn't even suspect. She said the divorce papers had been ready for a long time, that she hadn't filed them immediately, that she had been waiting. And this word got stuck in my head, because I didn't immediately understand what exactly it meant. But the more I thought, the clearer it became that this wasn't an impulsive decision, wasn't a reaction to one specific situation. It was a process stretched over time, just like her relationship with another person, just like her internal distance from me, which I hadn't noticed. I asked what she was waiting for, and the answer was simpler than I expected. And because of that, it became even heavier, because she said she was waiting for the moment when everything finally ended inside her, when there remained neither doubts nor attachment nor desire to save anything, and that this moment, according to her, hadn't come today or yesterday, but long ago. She just wanted to be sure she wouldn't regret it. And then I began to understand what I had refused to see from the very beginning. This wasn't about revenge, or at least not only about it. This was about gradual destruction that I had initiated but hadn't noticed how it continued without my participation, became independent, became something that no longer depended on my decisions, on my attempts to fix, on my desire to turn everything back. I began remembering her behavior over the last years, and suddenly many things ceased to be accidental, because her detachment, her rare outbursts of irritation, her moments of coldness, all of this wasn't a reaction to some trivialities, but part of something larger, part of a process that ran parallel to my life in which I thought everything was more or less normal. I tried to say that this was unfair, that she should have said earlier, that we should have had a chance to fix everything, and at that moment, I myself heard how hypocritical this sounded, because 5 years ago she didn't have that chance, because I didn't give her a choice. I simply presented her with a fact, and then she decided how to live with it. And it was here that something happened that I didn't expect. I stopped seeing myself only as the victim. This wasn't instant enlightenment. It wasn't some noble realization. It was a painful, unpleasant understanding that I was simultaneously both the one who was betrayed and the one who once did the same, albeit in a different form, albeit in different circumstances, but with the same result. And at that moment, something inside me changed, because I understood that from here I could continue fighting, could try to pressure, persuade, look for ways to hold her. But this would no longer be a fight for the relationship. It would be a fight for fear, for habit, for the illusion of control. And for the first time in all this time, I began asking myself a question I hadn't wanted to answer before. Is there even anything to save? Because if she had already left inside, if her decision had formed long before this conversation, if her life was already divided into 2 parts, one of which had no me in it, then everything I'm doing now is an attempt to catch a train that left not today, but several years ago. And it was at this moment that I first stopped thinking about how to get her back and began thinking about what to do with myself, because the truth I had avoided for so long finally became obvious. I lost her not at the moment when I saw that photograph. I lost her much earlier, and the worst thing was that I didn't even notice when exactly it happened. I naively thought that after everything said it would end quickly, almost formally, without extra noise, without dirt, without attempts to finally finish each other off, because at some point it seemed to me that at least understanding remained between us, that we were both guilty, that we had both done enough to destroy this, and that there was no point in turning it into a war. But this illusion didn't last long, because reality turned out to be completely different, much harsher and much colder than I was ready to accept. At first, everything looked calm. Filing documents, discussing terms, some dry formulations that reflected nothing of what was actually happening, and I tried to hold on to this as the last opportunity to preserve at least some dignity, to end everything without public humiliation, without the need to drag out what should have remained between us. But it quickly became clear that she had chosen a different path, and this path left me no space for a calm exit. When I received the official documents from her side, at first I didn't even understand what exactly I was reading, because the formulations were legal, cold, but the meaning broke through them too clearly. And this meaning was that she didn't simply want a divorce, she wanted everything. And under this everything was implied not only property, not only money, but also the complete consolidation of the role of the person who destroyed this marriage upon me. She provided evidence. And this was what I wasn't ready for, because in my head that episode with Elisha was something distant, closed, almost unreal, something that remained in the past and could no longer affect my life. But I was wrong again, because the past doesn't disappear anywhere. It simply waits for the moment when it becomes a convenient tool. Photographs, correspondence, dates, all of this was carefully collected, systematized, presented in such a way that left no room for interpretation. And at that moment I understood that she had been preparing for this not just for a long time, but very thoroughly, because this wasn't improvisation. This was a strategy thought through to the smallest detail, and from this it became even heavier. I felt not only anger, not only humiliation, but also some strange feeling of unreality of what was happening, because the person with whom I had lived, whom I had considered close, now looked at me through the prism of documents, evidence, arguments, as an opponent who needed to be beaten, not as someone with whom she once shared life. And then something switched inside me. Not immediately, not sharply, but clearly enough for me to understand that if I simply accepted all this now, if I allowed myself to be presented as the sole guilty party, if I agreed with the image she was creating, then I would lose not only the marriage that was already lost anyway, but also the remnants of self-respect, and this was what I wasn't ready for. I resisted this thought for a long time, because I didn't want to turn this into an open war, didn't want to drag out her infidelity, didn't want to descend to the level of mutual accusations, but at some point it became clear that there was no choice, because she had already made her move, and this move was aimed at leaving me with nothing. I gathered everything I had, and it turned out to be more than I thought. The photographs I had seen on her laptop were just the beginning, because when I began searching, when I stopped closing my eyes, when I allowed myself to see reality as it is, details began surfacing that had previously seemed insignificant, but now formed a clear picture, and this picture was just as unambiguous as the one she presented against me. 4 years. 4 years of double life. 4 years during which she lived with me and simultaneously built something parallel. And when I began recording this, when I began translating it into facts, into evidence, into something that could be shown, I felt how the last illusion disappeared inside me that this could be ended peacefully. The trial became the point where all of this came out, and I still can't fully describe this feeling, because this isn't just stress, not just pressure. It's a state in which your life is taken apart in front of strangers who evaluate it not as something personal, but as a set of facts that need to be interpreted. When her side presented their evidence, I saw the reaction of people in the hall, saw how their expressions changed, how opinion formed, and it was like a blow, because at that moment you understand that they have already begun perceiving you in a certain way, and changing this will be almost impossible. But when my turn came, when my arguments began to sound, when evidence of her infidelity was placed on the table, the reaction changed. And this was strange, because instead of relief I felt even greater heaviness, because this was no longer a story about one guilty and one victim. It became a story about two people who destroyed each other, and now this destruction had become public. I saw how people in the hall began to lose their bearings, how their initial certainty disappeared, how bewilderment appeared, because the picture ceased to be simple, ceased to be black and white, and at that moment I understood that we had both lost, regardless of what the outcome would be. She wanted to take everything. I wanted to preserve at least something, but in the process we both lost much more than we could have imagined. And when I sat there, listening to how our lives turned into arguments, into evidence, into legal formulations, I suddenly understood that this was no longer a fight for property, not a fight for truth. This was a fight over who would end up less destroyed in the end. And this was a fight in which it was impossible to truly win. Because even if you win on paper, you still remain with what can no longer be fixed. And at that moment I finally understood that there was no way back. Not for me, not for her. The court in the end did what courts do. Divided everything according to rules, by numbers, by documents, by those same dry criteria that have nothing to do with what actually happened between us. And when the final decision sounded, I felt neither relief nor anger, nor even satisfaction from the fact that I wasn't left with nothing, because by this point it was already clear that the case was never only about money or property, and no decision could return what we ourselves had destroyed long before this day. We left the courtroom together, but this together already meant nothing, because between us remained neither connection nor tension, nor even that anger that had been there before. There was only exhaustion, heavy, crushing, the kind that doesn't pass after sleep, because this isn't physical exhaustion, but the feeling that you have been in a state in which one cannot live for too long, and now the body has simply stopped reacting. I looked at her and for the first time in all this time felt no desire to prove something, felt no resentment in its usual form, felt not even jealousy, because all of this had already been lived through, burned out, worn down to a state where emotions cease to be sharp and become simply background. And in this background there was only one clear understanding. We had both gone too far for this to be somehow fixed. She looked just as exhausted as I did, and perhaps this was the only thing that still united us at that moment, because however much we tried to present this story as a struggle, as a confrontation, as an attempt to protect ourselves, in the end it simply turned out to be a long chain of decisions in which each of us at some point chose not what was needed and continued doing so again and again until it was too late. I said nothing to her, and she too. And perhaps this was right, because all words had already been said before, in those moments when they could still change something. But now any phrases would sound either empty or too late, and this too late became the main result of this entire story. We simply parted. Without a scene, without a final accent, without some symbolic completion that one usually expects from such moments, because in reality everything turned out much simpler and much heavier simultaneously. Two people who once chose each other simply stopped walking in the same direction, and at some point finally lost each other. And later, when I was alone, when there was no court, no conversations, no need to defend or attack, that feeling finally came to me which I had run from for so long, because it didn't fit into the simple scheme of who is right, who is guilty. I betrayed. She betrayed. But this doesn't make us equal, and doesn't make either of us right. Because my actions began earlier, because I made a choice then when it was still possible not to make it, because I decided that I could live with this, that I could leave it in the past, that I could simply move on without fully understanding the consequences. And she made her choice later. But she too lived with it, and perhaps her way of coping turned out to be more destructive, because it lasted for years. And now I don't know how to properly evaluate all of this, because if you look from one side, I got what I deserved. If you look from the other, no one deserves to live in a state where trust turns into a weapon. And the most uncomfortable question that remained with me after all this is not about who was worse, but about where the line passes between a mistake and what can no longer be justified. Because if betrayal can be explained by pain, does that mean it becomes acceptable? And if not, then why did we both still come to the same ending? I still don't know the answer. And perhaps it is precisely for this reason that this story still hasn't ended inside me, even though in reality it was concluded long ago.